Welcome to our lunchtime talk here at the Trinity Center for Asian Studies. I'm Nathan Hill, professor of in Chinese and the center's director, and it's my great pleasure this noontime to introduce Professor Kiri Paramore from University College Cork. He's a professor of Asian studies. Kiri is from Sydney and began his studies at the Australian National University in Canberra to then move on to Tokyo University, where he did his PhD. Then he taught for a number of years at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and only recently moved to Ireland a little over a year ago. And is an expert in intellectual history and the sociology of religion, with a specialism in Confucianism.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction by Professor Nathan Hill, and thanks very much for Dr. Isabella Jackson for inviting me to give this talk. It's great to be here in Dublin. It looks strangely like the inside of my house, but it's wonderful to be here nonetheless. So thanks for that introduction. Yeah, my background is in the history of political thought, and that's the sort of angle that I'm coming to this talk today. So the talk, as it was introduced, is about anti-China now and then, anti-Chinese racism in the liberal tradition. And I'd like to open the talk with a quote from the president of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. And this is a quote from him from just a couple of weeks ago, actually, as part of this seminar series that he's been delivering, that many of you might be aware of, sort of thinking about historical memory, ethnicity, sort of interaction between different peoples in the context of the commemoration of the War of Independence. I'll just quote from the president, quote, "It's easier to get a good critique going on nationalism than it is on empire. But it's important, because if you don't do it, you're at a disadvantage in understanding contemporary xenophobia, racism, and other attitudes." I think that, like many other interventions of the president over the last few weeks, has been a very sensitive and interesting and insightful opening. And I think hopefully you'll see that this talk has some interaction with that statement of a couple of weeks ago. So anti-Chinese and racism has obviously been growing massively over the past several years, and particularly the last year. And, you know, there in Dublin especially, you've seen all sorts of nasty manifestations of that around the mayor, people being pushed into canals. There's been sort of similar types of disorder here in Cork. And of course, that's nothing compared to what's happened in places like the United States and Australia. And related to that kind of disorder, there's been a sort of a public intellectual, so a very big anti-China push in the media, among politicians and public intellectuals, and in universities as well. And these things are related to each other. And I've just put in the chat box, I've put a little link to some statistics. There's actually lots of statistics online at the moment about cases of disorder, for instance, and relating those to different moments of, for instance, political tension. And so I just wanted to start by just acknowledging the seriousness of this topic in this way. But what I want to do today, actually, from my own background in political thought, is I want to focus on more academic themes, which are less momentary than this, that are slightly removed from, and perhaps thereby shed better and colder light on what's happening around us today. And that links into a sort of project I've been working on for a while, not so much for the last year, but before then, or thinking about, which is where I suggest that anti-China is a longue durée phenomenon. It's not just a phenomenon of discourse or stereotype or outlook. It's actually rather something embedded. It's an embedded element in the fabric of global political thought. And in this sense, I think it works in a similar way, or I think about it in a similar way anyway, to, in this book, Anti-Judaism by David Nirenberg, in a similar way to the way he thinks about a sort of longue durée, ongoing role for an imagination of an imagined, by the way, idea of Jewishness in Western political thought. And in the case of anti-China, that centers, I think, in global political thought, it has many different aspects, and that, of course, changes through time and place. And the project I'm envisaging, some work I've already done on that, is about actually anti-Chinese ideas in Asia, in pre-modern East Asia. I've already done a bit of work on that. But what I want to talk about today is when this discourse becomes global and where it's linked very directly to the liberal tradition and couched in terms of this idea of liberty versus despotism. So I want to talk about this, and this talk today will have three parts, three historical parts, after which I'll hand it over to you all, and we can have a discussion about any interaction that might have with the present. But the three sections of this talk is, first I want to talk about, I guess, what we could call Eurocentric anti-China. This is the anti-China of the late Enlightenment, which is familiar to many of you probably as Orientalism, right? Or in the Saidian idea of Orientalism. That's part one. Part two of the talk is what I call global anti-China. And this is where at the end of the 19th century, and then through the course of the 20th century, particularly in the way that World War II flows into the Cold War in the mid and late 20th century, the way that anti-China becomes a global discourse. And then in the third part, I'm going to step back a bit to a form of anti-China which is well historicized, settler colonialism, and think about the relevance of anti-China in settler colonialism and how that relates to that, what I would say is a contemporary anti-China that emerged out of the Cold War. So three sort of historical sections there. So let's begin with the anti-China, I guess quite familiar to some of you, this idea of Orientalism. Now, as Jürgen Osterhammel and other historians have demonstrated, this image of China emerged in the late Enlightenment as a reaction, as this sort of negative image of China or imagination of China emerged as a reaction to an idealistic vision of China, which people like Voltaire had, and Leibniz even in the early Enlightenment or even before the Enlightenment. But this latter vision, which comes to dominate from about 1800 or actually the late 1700s of China, is the China we're familiar with in Orientalism as timeless, static, despotic, unmoving, stuck in a static state of non-motion in a world otherwise, in this sort of modernizing world, defined by teleological progress. And this idea was inherited by key liberal thinkers of the 19th century. And I just want to sort of confirm that point. And that's been written about by a lot of other scholars, but I also want to add to that the economic aspect of this discourse before moving on to section two. So let me just pepper you with a few quotes. And I want to start with Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, which is why I mentioned the date 1776 in the title of this, because that was the publication date of Wealth of Nations, 2 years before the beginning of the colonization of Australia, by the way, as a prison colony. And I'll just quote a little bit from Adam Smith. So, quote, "China has long been one of the richest, that is, one of the most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious and most populated countries in the world. It seems, however, to have long been stationary." And then another quote, "China seems to have long been stationary and had probably long ago acquired that full complement of riches, which is consistent with the nature of its laws and institutions. But this complement may be much inferior to what, with other laws and institutions, the nature of its soil, climate and situations might admit of." So this unpacks an idea in Smith that China is actually, really rich, but is let down by inferior laws and institutions. And intriguingly, here we see the beginning of what other scholars would talk about as an imperialist discourse of, well, if we just change their laws, just help them there, change their laws and institutions, everything will be great. But what's really interesting to me, and I haven't seen picked up on so much before, is also how this is linked to a very specific economic argument about interest rates. Quote, "In every and linking despotism to interest rates, quote, "In every different branch, the oppression of the poor must establish the monopoly of the rich, who by engrossing trade to themselves will be able to make large profits. 12% accordingly is said to be the common interest of money in China, and the ordinary profits of stock must be sufficient to afford this large interest." Fast forward 3/4 of a century to John Stuart Mill, writing in 1848. Quote, and it's really interesting the way he picks up straight away, John Stuart Mill as well, on this interest aspect. Quote, no greater amount of capital than the country already possesses can find employment at this high rate of profit, and any lower rate does not hold out to a Chinese sufficient temptation to induce him to abstain from present enjoyment. So for Mill, this thing of interest is related to character, right? An inability to stop enjoying yourself in this case, right? Bit more, quote, denotes a much less degree of the effective desire for accumulation. In other words, a much lower estimate of the future. Quote, it is a defect of providence, not a defect of industry, that limits production among the Chinese. These quotes are from Principles of Political Economy from 1848. And you see already the way that character and this liberal idea of character as the center of production links in with earlier ideas from Adam Smith. The later Mill on Liberty in 1859 emphasizes this much more and really focuses in on despotism of character, using China repeatedly as the central example. I'm not going to quote from that because actually it's been well studied, right? So I mean, scholars like Uday Singh Mehta and others, I mean, they've pointed out what they would call racism in this period of liberal thought, and that's fine. But what I wanted to point out here is how centrally those ideas are related to capitalist accumulation. So although there's a cultural element, which we're all familiar with from reading Edward Said, the economic root is key here. And this is, of course, always also what makes sense of the way that these ideas transferred through to Marx, for instance. If we think of his idea of the Asiatic mode of production, which also uses, Adam Smith's ideas, and then that linking onto this idea of Asian despotism. So at the heart of the liberal idea of progress, in its concrete economic manifestation as capital accumulation, this is where this construction of anti-China lies. So let's then move on to section 2 of this talk, global anti-China. So the importance of this liberal creation of China, for me, lies in its transformation into a global discourse in the 19th century. Now, I've written elsewhere about pre-modern ideas of anti-China in places like Japan, but also Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar. But the arrival of this Eurocentric vision discussed, and there's great work on that, by the way, by people like Bradley Davis, but especially, the doyen of Southeast Asian history, Anthony Reid's written a lot about anti-Chinese ideas in, for instance, early modern Southeast Asia. Fascinating stuff. So, but the arrival of this Eurocentric vision that we just discussed, this overshadowed the more subtle sort of inter-Asian discourses. And this is because, of course, Western systems now dominated interstate relations. And specifically, this idea of semi-civilized or stagnant societies, the idea of stagnancy that's set central in that post-Enlightenment idea of anti-China, that was what was used to justify military and economic acts associated with imperialism in Asia. So anti-China became a convenient tool for any country to take action, not just against China, but against any country that could be associated with this image of China. For instance, Choson Korea or Nguyen Vietnam, or diasporic communities in Dutch-occupied Southeast Asia. So, if this anti-China was not only used against Chinese, it was used for imperial conquest of Koreans, Vietnamese, Malays, Javanese, Sumatrans, etc. And a signal of the globalism of this anti-China was its use by non-Western countries. And as I'll point out, it was used by many non-Western countries, especially in Asia. But Japan is the classic example. So, and Japan used anti-China not just against China itself, but against Korea. So by the time of the 1890s, the first Sino-Japanese War, and I'll just share you an image here that I'm going to talk about in a minute. I'll just put this in the chat box. I can copy that, and then I always think I'm going to save time by doing things differently, and it always ends up taking longer, I'm afraid. So this is just an image that I'm going to speak about in a minute. Yeah, at the time of the first Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s, which was, of course, fought to a large extent over domination of Korea and also led to Japanese control of Taiwan, the Japanese side represented the conflict totally in terms of an anti-China discourse of progress and stasis, modernity and tradition, which had now been crystallized in Western political theory for a century. Now, many scholars of modern East Asian history, like the people at MIT who compiled this source I've just shared with you, this visual source, many of them have pointed out the depictions of modernity and tradition, East and West. So the fact that in this image that I just shared with you, you know, the Japanese are in Western clothes, the Chinese are in traditional clothes, the Chinese are sort of, you often see them moving slowly because, you know, they use these Tokugawa forms of art which show movement. And this really fits in with this Saidian idea, of course, of Orientalism. But I'd like to point out today that this anti-China went much, much deeper than just these sort of representations of culture. And one example I've written about before is how Japanese liberals, notably Fukuzawa Yukichi, the most influential liberal thinker of East Asia, created particular cultural histories of China and Japan, which ethnically demarcated the human capacity of autonomous action and individual liberty. So my point here, and I'm just getting another thing to share with you, is that, you know, not to in any way, I mean, the sort of Orientalist-based critique of this is, of course, correct, but share that. There's something actually in. Did that go? No, that didn't go. There we go. There's something actually much deeper happening in the way that global political thought works underneath this. So in this article that I've just shared with you, this is an article in Modern Intellectual History from a while ago. I talk about this process and how Fukuzawa Yukichi uses certain liberal ideas, you know, from liberal thought to even more sort of racialize, I guess, the idea of liberty, but also the idea of despotism. And today I'd like to talk about another example that I haven't written about before, but I just try to present to you for the first time, which is also the way Fukuzawa Yukichi characterized the idea of the Chinese family. And I mean, for those of you who maybe don't know that much or aren't familiar with Japan, there you go, that's about 70 euros, right? That's a 10,000 yen note. And you see, I mean, there he is, right? So he's very much a central figure in sort of Japanese self-conceptions of modernity. And this is the book that I'm quoting from, Bumeiryo no Gairaku, Outline of a Theory of Civilization. So, you know, Fukuzawa had a very central role of the idea of the family in his thought. And following many British liberal thinkers, especially J.S. Mill, Fukuzawa and many other progressive liberal voices in Japan put huge emphasis on the role of the nuclear family, familiar intimacy in the context of an exclusive, monogamous, heterosexual, of course, relationship to create an autonomous liberal subject. And, you know, this is an important aspect of 19th century British liberalism that has until recently been a bit overlooked. But recently, for instance, in work by Lisa Lowe, that I'm going to talk about a bit later, has attracted attention again. And Fukuzawa deployed this idea of the family centrally against Chinese society, arguing that its traditional nature, the culture of family relations based in large clans and clan loyalty, undercut the capacity to be modern, the capacity to have progress. And as in the example of history that I've written about in that other article, Fukuzawa marked out a particular cultural, even ethnic nature of the Chinese as an impediment to self-government and progress, and an impediment to reform. What's important about these ideas is these go on to become incredibly influential, both in World War II and in the Cold War. And I mean, historians of, you know, the 20th century Asia Pacific, you know, a lot of historians agree these days, you know, that in the Asia Pacific context, the World War II never ends in a way, right? The Cold War is a continuation of World War II. So a lot of discourses that are operating in the Second World War, especially Japanese imperial modes of political thought, are actually picked up and adopted by the United States and its you know, system of satellite states, anti-communist states through the Cold War. So a lot of wartime Japanese political thought and ideology just continues on to become the dominant ideology, certainly in the Pacific, in the later 20th century. And in particular, this Japanese rehashing of backward China, which originally found form in the 1890s, went on to a long and prestigious career in that way. So, for instance, in what's called the 15-year war, right, or the war between 31 and 45, the long World War II, as it was for China, Japanese propaganda, but also thought, often portrayed the KMT and Communist Party officers, as bandits dressed in traditional clothing. They sort of use these Orientalist tropes. Japanese Pan-Asian ideology, especially in China, but across Asia, also pivoted to, and this has been talked about before, right? Again, this thing of dress and dress representing tradition. But Japanese Pan-Asian ideology actually pivoted to present the Japanese occupation also as a protection of the family and of family values. So, for instance, for one example, in a large body of trans-Asian cinema produced by Japan, and particularly Manchukuo's massive film industry during the 30s and 40s, yes, it was common to portray KMT and CCP officers in completely unrealistic ways, by the way, as very traditional, wearing traditional clothes. But many of the storylines which show that depiction, for instance, Nessa no Uta is one classic film where you see this, where the famous actress Lee Ko-ran plays the lead in this film, where the storyline often shows the Japanese facilitating progressive, modern-minded Chinese women or men trying to realize their dream to become individual subjects, to join a modern technological urban environment. And often emphasized in these plots was that the bandits were trying to destroy the romantic love, the modern sort of liberal romantic love between a modern Chinese woman and their partner, which often, funnily enough, was Japanese, but sometimes was Chinese, right, in these films. And they were held back by the bandits, the communists and the KMT, trying to drag them back into this pre-liberal familial world. Now, sometimes later, in some of the later manifestations of this, the bandits are not bringing them back into a traditional world, but anti-communist propaganda, for instance, it's a socialist, progressive, free love world of sexuality. But in either case, what it's about is non-conformism to standard liberal family models of intimacy. And again, Chinese sexuality, a particular depiction of Chinese femininity, is playing a major role here. So these portrayals of Chinese family intimacy rooted in a liberal vision, seeing the Chinese culture as synonymous with despotism opposed to freedom, these were then continued into the Cold War. As I mentioned earlier, historians, probably the most famous one, Prasenjit Duara, particularly in his book Sovereignty and Authenticity, but other historians over the past couple of decades have illustrated the extent to which the US's new sort of anti-communist satellite empire of mid and late 20th century Asia was modelled upon and co-opted not only the personnel, but also the political ideology of the Japanese empire. Actually, I just realized I forgot to share a couple of things with you, so I'll just share a couple more images before I forget. Hope it comes through. Yeah. The second image here is Park Chung-hee, as you all know, president of South Korea, or militarist president of South Korea. And there's him in his Imperial Japanese Army uniform, because he was an officer of the Manchukuo Army. And the link above that is a link to one of these films with Lee Ko-ran. This is about Byakuran no Uta, but film I referred to was Nessa no Chika. So just trying to get the right thing up on my screen here. They've talked about how, the personnel, but also the political ideology of the Japanese regime continued on. So anti-communist US satellite states, like South Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, all picked up in different ways the Japanese empire's ideology of progressive social and economic development under strong central leadership in an anti-communist jacket. And this was heavily inflected by anti-Chinese sentiment. So that anti-China was still one in which China was historically determined was historically determined to be unsuccessful in modern mental autonomy, represented models of family and sexuality which would destroy human intimacy, thereby destroying both traditional social structures and the liberal personal whole. So you see here, it's fascist Japan to begin with, but actually the ideology is still liberal. The ideology is still liberal, and the role of anti-China is still manifested through these earlier readings of liberal political thought. To mention one example from Southeast Asia, Ngo Dinh Diem, right, the president of South Vietnam, probably the most famous president of South Vietnam, who the Americans eventually deposed. He had a huge political organization and based around this ideology of personalism, which is a very complex ideology, has Confucian elements, has Catholic elements. But at the heart of this is also this liberal idea of the construction of the individual person. And that's what he used to very successfully, actually. He was a very successful anti-communist politician in terms of actually getting people to join him against the communists. So that's just one example. Now, of course, in all these different countries, this was used in different ways, but all of them experienced major anti-Chinese racialization of this political discourse of freedom versus despotism, through which Cold War anti-communist political thought worked. Because of China's central symbolic role as the center of communism in the Asia Pacific, and its quite real role as the main sponsor of anti-colonial struggle in the region, there was an interest to harness and perpetuate these same liberal colonial images of anti-China discussed above. Now, importantly, by the mid-20th century, this was happening in a world increasingly dominated, of course, by the United States. And this anti-China referenced above, which covered, if you think about it, 2/3 of the population of the Earth, right, which emanated from Japan and other Asian countries, also in this globality, in this sort of Pacific hot Cold War theatre, intersected, of course, with the anti-China tradition of settler colonialism, which was the anti-communist allies in Australia, New Zealand, and of course the United States itself. So in this last third section of the talk, I just want to revisit a couple of aspects of anti-Chinese racism in settler colonial society. Again, noting some interesting interactions with mainstream political thought. So settler colonialism. Over the past decade, the history of settler colonies, it's attracted a lot of attention in history writing, and particularly as a sort of site of the nexus between political thought and racism. So, British settler colonial societies like New South Wales, Victoria, New Zealand, British Columbia, but also all along the US coast. These were imagined from the imperial metropoles and to a large extent governed on the ground through the overt deployment of liberal political thought. Liberal political thought, so-called British liberalism, coupled with racism, also in these societies led to the transformation of self-government. So if you think of the fact that places like New South Wales, where I'm from, had self-government 25 years before Ireland shot its way to freedom, was all part of this story. And the act of colonisation itself, it's important to note, was, as Duncan Bell, this fantastic political theory scholar at Cambridge, has emphasised, colonisation itself was a key political objective of the young John Stuart Mill and many other leading liberal thinkers like T.H. Green and James Mill. So as Bell's pointed out, for these mid-19th century British liberals, colonisation of places like Australia was part of a civilising mission, meant not only to civilise the imperial antipodes, but also the imperial metropole. This would allow the British worker to be civilised into something culturally more like their industrious bourgeois betters, as it would, of course, allow the places colonised, the new dominions, to become beacons of civilisation to other people. And I hope I'm shining bright for you right now. So, just as in the case with anti-China, underlying this liberal discourse of culture and civility, however, was a hard capitalist rationale. So J.S. Mill was a key advocate of colonialism. He was a founder member of the South Australia Association, which promoted free labour, systematic colonisation. But it's interesting that Mill's proposal of how that colonisation should be systematised included ensuring that workers could not purchase land. that capital and labour were separated. Quote, each labourer is induced to work a certain number of years on hire, and the parallel with indentured labour have been made. For Mill, this approach was also part of ensuring the colonial project's success in its civilization mission, because this system would hold colonials. And by the way, he's talking about English and Scottish people here. He's talking about, what white English and Scottish people. It would hold them under the control. Quote, it has been a beneficial check upon the tendency of the population of colonists, by which he means English people primarily, to adopt the tastes and inclinations of savage life. So a bit on the theory of colonisation, but what has this got to do with anti-Chinese racism? Liberal condemnation of unfree labour, famously, slavery, but also Bentham's critique of convict colonial labour, was coupled with the advocacy of a replacement form of labour, which they called free labour, but which often was actually advocated as indentured labour. In the British Empire in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, in the Dutch Empire in the Caribbean, in the US Pacific, of course, the main source of this indentured labour was China and India, and principally China. Now, I just want to quickly recap the reality of Chinese indentured labour, for instance, in New South Wales. And then I want to contrast that with the very interesting liberal imagination of what Chinese immigration to these places was supposed to be. Now, it's well known that the reality of most Chinese migration to New South Wales, Victoria, British Columbia, California, these kind of places in the late 19th and early 20th century was that migrants were shipped in inhumane conditions. They were often shipped in, they were basically slave ships a lot of the time. They were ruthlessly exploited. Nearly 100% were indentured after the first 10 or 20 years. And very importantly, and this is something that writers like Anne Stoller have pointed out, they were detached from intimacy. They were detached from family units that were segregated by gender. And the vast majority were male. In some areas like New South Wales, for example, there were literally, virtually no females among tens of thousands of Chinese labourers who were brought there. Most female migrants who did come, not to New South Wales, but other places, were also indentured and often ended up being exploited as sexual labour. And scholars of Asian American studies like Jennifer Ho have linked this history to later, including contemporary images of Asian female sexuality in the contemporary United States. But what's intriguing is how this contrasts against the liberal imagination of what was going to happen with this Chinese free labour as it came in. Correspondence from a range of colonial archives, and I'm relying here on Lisa Lowe's recent book, Intimacies of Four Continents, for some of these sources. It shows that the elite imagination of the role of Chinese indentured labour, that is the liberal European elite, was very different. Preference for Chinese labour was born of a belief that the particular cultural traits of Chinese colonial labour would further cultivate the kind of liberal culture that Mill had referred to earlier in his hope of colonial migration playing a civilizing role. So although conceived of as replacing African slave labour in the Caribbean, convict labour in Australia, liberal officials and colonial administrators, they actually saw Chinese free labour providing solutions to other problems. So Lisa Lowe quotes a British colonial official from 1803, just after the Haitian uprising, with a very good Cork name of John Sullivan. And I'll just double quote from him. No measure would so effectually tend to provide a security against this danger, the danger of revolution, as that of introducing a free race of cultivators into our islands who from habits and feelings could be kept distinct from black people, he uses another word, and who from interest would be inseparably attached to the European proprietors. The Chinese people unite the qualities which constitute this double recommendation. Through the 19th century, this develops into an overt attempt to recreate the middle-class family imagined in liberal thought as the basis of a stable, productive order. This is from a mid-19th century source. Quote, Chinese have sufficient intelligence and ambition to rise in the world and in a short time would become useful and valuable as our middle class in the West Indies. One difficulty is the impossibility of obtaining women and families. So on the one hand, liberal metropole theoreticians and liberal colonial administrators on the ground shared this vision of Chinese immigration, which would include women and families, which would provide the basis of this middle class that they were imagining. But on the other hand, the reality of indentured labour was completely different, especially as it came to this issue of sexuality. Anti-Chinese racism in settler colonial societies, particularly on the Pacific Rim, is heavily researched. But until recently, that research hasn't really engaged this bigger political thought context. And this is what I was thinking about with the president's comments of moving on from ideas of nation to empire. Unlike the culturally founded critiques which have dominated our discussion over the last, until recently, anti-Chinese racism in the settler colonies, although sometimes drawing on these early ideas, is more often characterised by issues of labour, as we've seen in the quotes from Mill. And these were part and parcel of liberal approaches to colonisation. And this created a more highly charged form of anti-China, particularly because racism on a large scale was directed by labouring class people for the first time, really, right? Not just the upper class, who were the normal purveyors of racist ideology. And because of that cultural, physical and economic real proximity between the purveyors and objects of racism, the idea of race became very dominant. The imagining by the liberal elite of Chinese as a model middle class, family value oriented free labour, as we saw above, stood in stark contrast to the reality of bonded Chinese indentured labour, not only removed from political liberty, but removed from those very family structures of intimacy which liberalism held up as the basis of civilization, but which the reality of colonial structures precluded. The reality of Chinese people, as encountered, for instance, by white colonials or Aborigines in Australia, was not any reality of ordinary Japanese family life, be it liberal, nuclear, traditional clan or otherwise. The Chinese they were confronted with was a constructed, all male, all young, barracked, disciplined, controlled, late 19th century imperial creation. One which was quite familiar to the former convict white Australians or former slave African Caribbean labourers who they were still around at this stage, right? In a sense, while liberal theory imagined the Chinese in colonies as a signal to the middle class future of freedom, the white and black labouring populations of the colonies on the ground saw them as a throwback to the regimented prison life of their own pasts. And this leads to this central idea of, of progress and stasis. You see how this experience of colonial white people, for instance, sits deeply in this idea of motion and time. In short, this was the reality of late 19th century capital colliding with the theory of liberalism. Liberal capitalism sort of tearing itself apart. In the midst of this, China became the symbol of regression away from liberty. Not only the totem of despotism, but the messenger that the liberal part of the liberal capitalist covenant, the promise of freedom, would not be kept. In late 19th century California and Australia, the solution was anti-Chinese racism on a grand scale. The Chinese were the symbol of the hypocrisy of liberal capitalism. But of course, the Chinese had not created, nor were they in control of the social and economic system through which liberal elites attempted to drive down wages in late 19th century settler colonial Pacific. But they did become the symbols of it. Crucially, however, this symbolism was anchored in a depiction of China at the centre of liberal political economic thought, which underlay this view of China as representative of despotism against freedom. Again, of course, we assume this construct so much, but in this artificial construction of liberty versus despotism. Duncan Bell says, we today are all conscripts of liberalism. We're under the control of liberalism. And he doesn't say this, and then I say this, liberty and despotism are like heaven and hell when Europe was under the control of the Catholic Church, right? It's a similar, that's very simplistic, but a similar sort of a parallel. So what does this mean for the present? Well, I want to sort of throw that open to you also because I think I've used up my time. But to move to the present, just make a very brief couple of comments. I'd suggest this same movement is at play. Chinese people are not in control of issues relating to liberty, but in a civilizational context, global liberal political thought, which identifies China as the antithesis of liberty, they become symbols. And there's a relationship here with COVID-19 Because if you think, the main effect of COVID-19 for most people is not sickness, it's limitation of freedom. Freedom is central. There's a relationship also with international political tension that's going on at the moment, because it's still framed in most parts of the world in Cold War frames. The Cold War frames that I spoke about, East versus West means despotism versus liberty. So I guess the lesson for the present is that what we see in anti-China is not just scapegoating. Anti-China underlies and sits at the basis of the perception of social progress, of teleological advancement, shared by liberals and also shared by many socialists as an outcome of the crystallization of political economic thought in the late 19th century. So the entire political thought context is primed to have a liberal colonial administrator, or a self-educated socialist worker, or a contemporary humanities academic identify attacks on liberty with a particular country or ethnic group. And there's more things I could link on. I mean, I've got more here. I mean, it'd be very interesting to talk about, for instance, the way that, this split between liberty and capitalism has actually also been acknowledged, was acknowledged by J.S. Mill, so acknowledged very recently in relation to China by Henry Kissinger, for instance, also. So there's also an internal liberal acknowledgement and debate about that, which is also interesting. But for the moment, I think I should leave it here and throw it open to your discussion. Thank you.
All right. Well, so I'll be chairing the question period, and I would encourage any attendees to who have questions to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. We have two questions so far. One just came in, so I'll read those out. The first question, which is very close to my heart somehow, is about let's say, particularly in the context of the Second World War, you talked about the way that the sort of discourse of progress can be used in the subjugation of people. So can you say anything about kind of well, I'll just read it. China's relationship with its own minorities, like the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, where there are also discourses of backwardness and if you like, a kind of white man's burden sort of relationship with these people, and that their traditional cultures are keeping them back. And then I would also say, this isn't in the original question, but that oftentimes that also has a family and sexual dynamic to it. So let's say, I mean, maybe the question is about, it's odd maybe to see the kind of mimetic reproduction of these discourses that were built against the Chinese, being used by the Chinese against their own indigenous peoples. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, in the article that I shared from Modern Intellectual History, part of that, the approach of that article is to look at Fuxiao Yukichi, but also to look at Chen Dushou, the founder of the Chinese Communist Party. So definitely, modern China uses this anti-China thing as well. Definitely, and in terms of the issues with minorities, that's absolutely the case. Yeah. So I think in navigating this, I think it's funny to throw this up as an example because it's such a dysfunctional example. But I think the way we need to think about this is, for instance, like anti-Semitism. Right? I mean, anti-Semitism, I mean, Arabs are Semites, right? So, I mean, many people have said that, the way Israel treats Palestinians is anti-Semitic, right? But also, but most anti-Semitism through history, through Western history, has been about Jewish people. And there is a long tradition of targeting Jewish people and relating their ethnicity to certain political ideas. So how do you navigate between critique of Israel and what's underlying, as David Nierenberg, says, underlying so much of the way political thought works in Western civilization, which invites anti-Semitic, as in anti-Jewish, racist comments? How do you navigate that? Now, a lot of work's been done on that. And I think we need to start thinking about that in relation to China as well. We need to take apart, these different anti-Chinas, if you like. So thanks very much. And thanks, my dear colleague, Professor Katrina Nadul, for that very interesting question.
So whoops. I may have done something wrong. No, there we go. Okay. Yeah. So the second question, very interesting. In the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith talks a lot about this idea of the earthquake in China, and notices, that or in his theory of morality, or just as an observation, we're more affected by those who are closer to us than those who are around the other side of the world, and that the question is basically about maybe there's an element of anti-Chinese sentiment that's a part of the liberal tradition that you haven't touched on, which is the use of sort of sympathy with normal Chinese people as kind of the example par excellence of universalism we should feel bad for those Chinese people on the other side of the world when bad things happen to them. Do you see a role for that in the construction of the liberal tradition as well? That sort of.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. I see that questions from another dear colleague, Hansen Shong, who's at Durham, and I was up at 4 a.m. this morning actually reading a fantastic paper by Hansen Shong actually about as said in Australia, about printing and the idea of the yellow peril. It's fascinating. I think Hansen knows a lot more than I do about this particular element. And yeah, I think the simple answer will be yes. And just again, to just sort of expand off that, remember that's also the reason we invade Iraq, to save them and bring them democracy, and how grateful I'm sure they all are for that. So I think it's important to see it rubs. Yeah. It rubs two ways. I mean, I know Hansen, you know that, but it rubs two ways, and I just want to point that out to sort of as well. So yes, it's sympathy, and that sympathy can be very dangerous as well if it's not understood.
So now I'd like to ask a question myself, which is kind of about the early period, and I will hopefully can formulate it clearly, which is that, I mean, as you mentioned, kind of in the early Enlightenment, people loved China. Yeah, Voltaire loved China, and even before the Renaissance, Francis Bacon was a big China enthusiast. But I noticed actually, just as you were talking, that there's still a continuity there, which is that Voltaire and these sort of early Enlightenment figures liked China because it was timeless, and that there was in the course of the 18th century this battle in Europe between the ancients and the moderns, and both sides agreed, that let's say China might represent, kind of like Greece or Rome, some sort of idyllic, timeless, ethical articulations. And so I think what was interesting to me about that is it sort of pulls apart two elements of the story you're telling. One is the kind of descriptive accuracy of a particular claim at any one time, and the other one is the value judgment. So just to ramble a little bit more, if someone says, something about the land and the institutions of England, I don't know, like that it's flat, that they had deforestation and enclosures, made capitalism happen, and those things didn't happen in China because of the land and the social relations, the institutions over there. That would seem like it doesn't need to have any moral meaning. But once you've said, well, capitalism is a good thing, accumulation is a good thing, progress is a good thing, and you've identified that China doesn't have those, then you're in a different realm. And I almost think like now, I could imagine people telling me that, the fact that land wasn't totally easy to alienate, and they had notions of qi running through it and whatnot, might be a potential environmentalism that we could even valorize now. Yeah.
Indentured's most recent work, sort of goes a little bit there actually. So that's
Yeah. Okay.
just to follow on from the beginning of your point, you know, this continuity through early sort of enchanted by China enlightenment to late disenchanted by China enlightenment. Another important continuity is rationalism, and this is the thing I didn't have time to talk about today, which is a key idea, is rationalism. And in both cases, China represents rationalism. And this is another thing a lot of people forget about that 19th century liberal moment, is it's heavily Christian. Rationalism is not. It's about the moral character. And so rationalism becomes problematic. Rationalism is often the core thing used in racist attacks. Again, especially in the 20th century, anti-Semitism also. Rationalism is associated with these images of Judaism through several points of period. According to David Mirabern, I'm no expert on this, but it's a key part in that 20th century moment. So that's a really interesting continuity between different periods of early modern and modern history, but also between anti-Chinese discourse and anti-Semitism.
So another question, this one now is, it's an interesting point. Chinese intellectuals at different times, especially, in the late Qing, were enthusiasts about rationality, liberalism, the nuclear family, capitalism to some extent. Do you have any story to tell us about the kind of positionality of Chinese intellectuals in these traditions?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is similar to, and I think the question is similar to Katrina Dull's question. So, yes, and as I say in that article in Modern Intellectual History, I directly engage that. So in that particular case, I use Chen Duxiu, but as my dear colleague Dr. Schneider knows, I could have used many other modern Chinese thinkers to make that point. So definitely, yes, that's used. Just like I said, just like anti-Semitism is used by Israel, right? So, yeah, definitely.
It looks like, if I'm understanding these things correctly, that Isabella would like to jump in here. Is that right?
No.
No. Okay, sorry. There was okay. Never mind. Yeah, there was a strange message that said you did. Okay.
The joys of Zoom. What a pity we won't be Zooming.
Okay, well then so maybe I'll ask a question that I feel like you sort of danced around at various moments. You mentioned sort of Marx and the Asiatic mode of production. I'm just quite curious, sort of as an aside, about sort of how the Maoist tradition sort of thinks about the place of China in Hegelian thought and Marx in particular, but they basically got around by saying China had been feudalist. But what I'm interested in is most of your story was a story of sort of the nuclear family, imperialism, colonialism, all sort of being part of a package of the reproduction of the capitalist labor relation as a kind of global project emanating from the West. But there is, a tradition that has had less, let's say, on the ground success, but some on the ground success, which is designed explicitly to critique that. And yeah, and maybe that I can just sort of leave it dangling there, but let's say, is the critique, like, how can I say, you presented, this is, I think, right, you presented Marxism as just sort of another Western ideology that has an anti-China, sentiment at its base, but one could wonder whether there's more to that in terms of, well, except this particular ideology is not interested in reproducing the capitalism labor relation, right?
Well, some people, some critical Marxists would say, the Soviet Union, for instance, and certainly China after Deng Xiaoping is interesting.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I think the interesting thing I was thinking about, another sort of thing that you mentioned, is you said emanated from the West. I just want to make, because that's probably my fault, so I just want to make that clear. I don't see this. This is a global phenomenon. So, for instance, the reason why this is remarkable think about Australian Aborigines. Australian Aborigines are terribly treated. And there's these horrible discourses against Australian Aborigines, which of course I grew up with, right? But they're not global discourses, right? This discourse is not something that emanates in the West. It's global. So the reason I talked about those Japanese examples is because, you know, the Japanese experience, Japanese thought, you know, had a huge impact. This is something that still, I don't think is coming out enough in history writing, especially people outside Asian studies don't understand, but Japanese thought had a huge impact on the way global political thought, global sociology, all sorts of things developed during the Cold War. There's recent writing about that. I wrote a little article in the Journal of Asian Studies, which didn't directly counter this, but which talked about Robert Bellah, and directly after that, Amy Borovoy, who's a professor of Asian Studies at Princeton University. She wrote this amazing article about the role, about how a lot of Bellah's ideas on the sociology of America, you know, they come from Wasuji Tetsudo and other Japanese thinkers. So the idea of the anti-China we have today, this global anti-China, this is not just J.S. Mill, right? This is something that has emerged through a global process, and that is a global discourse. And I think that's why academically, like obviously I just chose to speak about today because we're living in the times we live. But the reason why I was thinking about it 4 years ago is because academically it's really interesting for that reason. If this was a story of Western thought, you know, affecting this and that, now it's not interesting, is it? It's not interesting to me anyway, right? This is global, and the players, people like Nojin Diem, you know, his political thought being studied, you know, just the last 20 years in the English speaking world, incredible stuff. You know, people, they just brush these people off as, oh, they're just American puppet regimes or whatever, you know. Much more complex and interesting than this, much more complex. So, you know, that's why probably I haven't, because I'm still in the early stages of this, and because of the pandemic, and because we're on Zoom, maybe that didn't come through enough, and I hope to build on this. But what I see and sort of what I'm trying to bring out is that indeed that global aspect of this.
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent point, and that may be, you know, it may have been my fault in some ways, and I'm tempted to even point out that even at the earliest moment, like the ethnographic reports coming in from the Jesuits around the world played a role in the whole construction of the idea of the Enlightenment project in terms of freedom and individuality, in terms of comparing European societies to societies that were being found around the world. A last question, which also sort of has the feel of a last question, and I will try and put it well, which is kind of, you know, looking to the future, like, well, you know, if so, you know, you had this great phrase where all conscripts, was that it?
Yeah,
conscripts.
It's Duncan Bell's.
Okay, yeah, conscripts of liberalism. You know, I mean, I see even I don't know, to take one example, the relationship in European and Irish higher education regulation about the expectations that different disciplines play in the in the reproduction of capitalist relations, you know, which is somehow embedded in racism, including anti-Chinese racism. Sort of, well, where do we go from here? You know, like, do you have any sense of, like, you know, having noticed, like if we understand the past and we understand the genealogies of the ideologies that shape the world that we live in, what's the next step?
Are you sort of riffing on this question from Sean Darcy?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Look, it's all together. This is the point, you know. Because I can see Sean Darcy's question. He's saying, look, there's these different approaches. Is there a world where USA, Europe, Chinese ways of life can go together? So I'm afraid I'm an old universalist, and I still see it that way. You know, so what, you know, like some of the questions from Julia Schneider and Professor Katrina Nadul, these questions that said, is this used in China? Yes, it's used in China, right? Yes, anti-China is used in the history of China, right? We're all in the same paradigm, right? We're all in the same paradigm, you know. You don't have to be Israeli or Palestinian to be affected by anti-Semitism, you know. And that's the thing when you read a book like this. Anti-Semitism sits at the basis of the way we all imagine the world. So I think it's just
that sounds very pessimistic, though. You know,
increase understanding, I think, is the only thing we can do.
Okay.
And, you know, like people are trying to do. You know, how do you criticize Israel and not be an anti-Semite? You know, there are ways to do this, right? We just have to think about that, and we have to increase knowledge as much as possible, and continue to think about these questions and discuss them.
Yeah. Okay. So at
Sounds
least,
like a liberal. I really sound like a liberal, don't I? Like a
yeah. I mean, I was gonna say, so I was looking for some kind of violent worldwide revolution, but in the meantime, we can all just understand the world and our past more deeply, and the better that understanding is, the more let's say, to use a loaded word, rational we can be in in reacting to our options now. Yeah. Okay, well, this was a extremely interesting and stimulating talk, and I think that, well, I hope I have evidence that our guests thought so as well, and hopefully we'll see you all, including Kiri, at more events, maybe before long, even in person. Thank you. Thank you all for
everybody in Dublin who was there. I'll see you soon when they put the train back, or the train's on, but I'm scared to go on it. But thank you so much for the invite again. Thank you for all the dear colleagues who asked questions and made comments. Really useful as well. And indeed, as Nathan said, looking forward to seeing you all in person.